So it is my distinct joy to welcome and introduce to you all Reverend Chris Haden. Chris is the pastor of Kindred United Methodist Church, which is down in Winter Park. But more importantly, it's not fair. But also important to me is that he is my brother in our covenant group, and he is someone who I care for a lot. I love this guy. His ministry and his friendship have been an incredible gift to me, and I know that he will be to us tonight. So I just want to join me in welcoming Chris Haden. Yeah.
Thank you. I will do my best to live up to that. So it's weird. Kindred UMC is kind of a strange church, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the sermon. But this is actually the first sermon I've preached to human beings in maybe 2 years or so. So here we go. I'm going to be talking about the text we find in Genesis chapter 32, looking at verses 22 through 32, and they go like this. The same night I hate it when they start with a pronoun. He is a man named Jacob. And he's in the line of Abraham. So this is one of the sons of Abraham. The same night, he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." When the man said, "You shall no longer be," when the man said, hold on, I lost my place. "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" Which is probably better translated as, you don't need to know my name. And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, which means face of God, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Weird, right? Yeah. Is this okay? Am I ruining anybody's shot or anything? Okay, great. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here. And don't worry, we're going to get to it. But first, I wanted to say just a little bit about my background. Something that's not immediately obvious about me when you see me is that I used to study mixed martial arts. I was in much better shape then. But even at my peak, even when I was like in fighting shape, I was always the smallest, weakest guy at the gym. Like, there was just no getting around it. I don't have a big frame. I have a tall frame, and I'm kind of lanky. And as I get older, I'm a little softer in the middle. That's just the way it goes, right? So often when I would be at the gym with these big, huge, muscle-bound wrestling dudes, they would start to tell these stories, and it was over around Tampa Bay, and Hard Rock Cafe, or Hard Rock Casino is in Tampa Bay, and so they would have all these stories about like going out to the casino and like partying and then like getting in fights and like, "Oh, I punched him and he punched," and they would have all these crazy stories, and the whole time, like I grew up a nice boy. Like, I've never been in I have a black belt in Taekwondo, and I've studied, and aside from sparring, I have never been in any type of a fight in my life. And so I was just shocked by this. And so the instructor, the guy who actually was a professional cage fighter and had like titles to his name and stuff like that, when he came around as we were doing some drills, I was like, "Man, do you hear these guys talk? Like, have you ever been in a..." He's like, "No." Like, he's the only one in the room that could absolutely defeat almost anyone he meets, and he's never been in a fight. And I realized, like, most people want to avoid fights, and especially most people who have been punched in the face before. Like, it's an unpleasant idea to be in a physical fight with somebody. And that's why I think it's so interesting that one of the pivotal texts that is one of the foundational elements of our faith and our history as Christians is about God fighting somebody. God gets in a fight with this guy, Jacob. Now, I think to understand that, you kind of have to understand a little bit about Jacob's life. So first of all, Jacob was the youngest of two twins, which is weird, but it matters because that means that his brother, who technically was born first, gets the firstborn inheritance. And Jacob, it's said, came out pulling his brother's heel. And that's what Jacob means. It means to pull, he pulls his leg. Or maybe a better title, like chain yanker, like trickster. That's what Jacob is. And that's who he grows up to become. You see, not only does his brother get the inheritance, the bigger portion of the inheritance, but he also gets the generational covenantal blessing that goes back to his ancestor Abraham. The covenant that Yahweh made with Abram, because his name wasn't even Abraham yet. That blessing goes down the firstborn line, the firstborn male, because, sorry, it's an ancient patriarchal society, I apologize, but the firstborn male always gets this. And so first of all, Jacob swindles his brother out of his inheritance using the power of soup. Now, you can't do that unless you've got a really sharp silver tongue. And this is what Jacob has. Jacob is a smooth talker. He's a trickster. And after he gets the inheritance, he then later goes into his father, who is on his deathbed, disguises himself as his much hairier brother, and pretends to be his brother so that his father will pass down the covenantal blessing to him instead of the one that it ought to be. So now Jacob has stolen the two most prized possessions from his family, and he has to flee. He has to run because his brother's literally going to murder him. And he runs, and as he's fleeing, as young men are so oft wont to do, he finds a girl and falls in love. And he tries to convince the girl's father to let him marry her, and they work out a deal, because that's what Jacob does. He works out deals, He uses his talk. And so he's going to work 7 years, and then he's going to get to marry his lovely bride. But father tricks him, and he accidentally marries the wrong sister. But Jacob doesn't give up because he's a smooth talker, and this is what Jacob does. He works deals. So he goes back to the father, and he says, listen, I'll give you 7 more years of work if you'll let me marry the other sister now. And he does it. So now Jacob has 2 wives, but he's indentured for 7 more years. But he does it. He pays it off. Now, unfortunately, what starts to happen is the woman that Jacob doesn't really love that much is the one who's bearing him sons, which is a big deal in the ancient Middle East. And the one that he loves, despite their best efforts, is not getting pregnant. And this creates some strife. And so what do? Well, he's not going to give up. He comes up with a plan. Why don't you send your maidservant in? And it turns out that she can bear sons. And then the one whom Jacob doesn't love says, that's a good idea, I'll do the same thing. And so now Jacob has 11 sons with 4 different women. Well, eventually it comes time for Jacob to move on. He's going to strike out on his own. And so he talks to his father-in-law about what share of the property he should get. And so they're dividing it up, and Jacob basically rigs this system so that all of the young, fertile goats in the herd end up on his side, and all the kind of the old over-the-hill, can't have any goat kids anymore, those goats end up on his father-in-law's side. So once again, Jacob has swindled, has conned, has figured a way out to get his best for him. And as they are traveling along, that's when Jacob gets the word that his brother Esau, the one who he stole the inheritance and the blessing from, is coming straight for him with 400 soldiers. And Jacob's got his family, his servants, and his goats. Not much of an army. And that's where this text picks up. Jacob has sent everything he owns to the other side of the river, and he's going to wait to meet his brother, who's going to arrive by the next morning. And after all of this life of swindling and earning and making for himself and taking from others and getting what's his, he finds that it's all going to amount to nothing the next morning. And as he spends the night waiting for his death, God attacks. And I think it's an interesting phrase. I don't know, have you ever felt attacked by God? Or maybe not attacked, maybe like abandoned. Maybe like God wasn't keeping up his part of the bargain. Maybe like God wasn't there for you when some pretty bad stuff happened. I have felt that way before. It's a scary, bad feeling. So here's something about me. This is a weird thing. I have always had this really great talent of being able to build excellent teams. And it started when I was young, and I would build bands. I would play in bands and bars and stuff. And the first band I ever did is called Comic Book Villains. And it was a great name because every time I said it, somebody would be like, "Oh, I've heard of you guys." I'm like, no, you haven't. We're not that popular. It's just a good name. But the drummer for that band turned out to be a touring music. He's the band leader for a guy named Gavin DeGraw, who you probably have heard his songs on the radio. He tours with that guy and is his band leader now. Like, this guy turned out to be amazing, and I got him to be in my first band. And then after he kind of grew out of our band, we replaced him with two other people, and those two guys eventually moved to New York and are writing musicals on and off Broadway together. Like, seriously talented musicians. The church that I grew up in, I started a contemporary worship band there, and the drummer for that band used to play bass for the Commodores. And then this stuff kept happening to me over and over and over again. And when I'm in like a job interview situation, when I'm like having to prove myself to others who might control my career or something, I say one of my talents is I build good teams. And in fact, the church that I'm at now, the basics of the appointment that I'm at now was a church was closing, and they needed somebody to not just relaunch a new church, but to reinvent church for people who don't go to church, to completely come up with a system of worship and small group discipleship and all this. And I'm like, yeah, I build good teams. And I remember feeling like a fraud when I said it. Because even though I do have a great track record at it, here's the God's honest truth. I have no idea what I'm doing or how it works. I have no idea. It's panicky. It's anxiety like I don't know why, but when I go there just happens to be this amazing, talented person there, and I go, "Hey, okay, great. Well, we lucked out again," like, and so as I'm selling myself, because I really want to be appointed at this church, and I'm selling myself to my DS, and my DS and I are talking, and inside I'm going like, I feel like a fraud. Like, I hope I can do it again. Like, please, God, let me do it again. And I imagine that's how Jacob feels all the time. Because he's a swindler. Because he's a con artist. Because he's dead set on doing it his way, under his gumption, with his skills and his stuff, and constantly kind of screwing it up all along the way. And I feel like that sometimes when I'm like, I build good teams, I'm a good pastor. And it's like, well, I don't know. It feels like I get lucky a lot, Jacob wrestles with God. Jacob, the heel puller, wrestles with God. And at first it seems like God might be really mad with Jacob. But here's the thing. Jacob is in the hands of a master. And when he's wrestling with God, he's in the hands of a loving father. And rather than allowing Jacob to just continue on to his destruction, God is willing to get down in the mud with him. And when God gets down in the mud with him, what's really ironic about this story is that Jacob wins the fight. Jacob wins the fight. And God says, it's almost day, let me go. And here's the brilliance of the God that we worship. The man who's been running from responsibility and his God his entire life has now grabbed hold of this God and said, I will not let you go until you bless me. And then God says, what's your name? And he says, my name is heel puller. My name is con artist. My name is trickster. And he says, you will no longer be called Jacob, but you will be called Israel, which means to wrestle with God. And this is our legacy. We do not worship a God who, when we feel attacked or abandoned or let down or scared or afraid or doubtful or have questions, we don't worship a God who says, I'm bigger than you, sit in the corner and be quiet. We worship a God who, when you go to this God and say, where are you? I can't feel you. I don't know what's going on here. Are you even going to show up when I go to this new place? You haven't been there and protected me the way that I want to be protected in the past. And that God doesn't say, get away. He says, let's wrestle. Come here, bring it to me. Let's do it. Let's go round and round. I'm happy to say that once again, in my new appointment, God showed up. But it wasn't easy, and it wasn't smooth, and it wasn't all nice and neat. It was, quite frankly, felt like we were rolling around in the mud a lot together. But that's okay, because by the end of it, Jacob walks out with a limp. He walked in under his own strength, but he walks out leaning and dependent. And this will be the nature of Israel's relationship with God forever. They are utterly dependent. When they find themselves enslaved in Egypt, it is God who rescues them. When they find themselves thirsty and hungry in the desert, it's God who provides water and food. When they find themselves in all sorts of trouble, giants in the land, you name it, it's God who's going to do the rescuing. And that's scary because God and I don't always agree on what's good. But that's good because I can always wrestle with him about it. So my hope and my prayer for you all is that when you find yourselves in your faith and in your relationship with God, wondering where God is, wondering if there's a plan to any of this, wondering if God is any good at being a God at all, that you won't shove those feelings or those thoughts away, that you won't package them away in some deep, dark, secret place where they never see the light of day, because God knows those places too. That's where he lives, That instead you'll unpackage them, you'll open them up, and you'll be willing to wrestle. Let's pray. Holy Lord, I give you great thanks for the blessing of the relationship that you allow us to have. We don't deserve it, we can't earn it, but you are so gracious and so loving. And so, with great humility, I will do my best to honor the gifts that you have given. The opportunity and the permission to be honest with you, to treat you not like some overlord all the time, but an actual loving Father. For those of us who are struggling, for those of us who have places where we're not sure if you are any good at all, I pray a good wrestling match. I pray a loving confrontation. And I pray ultimately healing and redemption through that act. We ask this all in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.